YouTube, how far art thou, YouTube? Warbles on a lot here, with the slightly more than alcohol affected book reading. Okie Madoki, we have done the Quiet Australian. Let's go down to the last of the fun wars. This may take two separate uploads. This is when Neil Davis was 29 years old. He'd taken a job in Singapore in 1963 as cameraman correspondent for Viz News, a British imperial news agency. On page 71 commences the last of the fun wars. Right. Confrontation was a grass fire war, really. Military harassment, but a war nevertheless. It was named and instigated by President Sukarno, the father of Indonesia's independence, to oppose the newly independent Malaysia, which included the former British North Borneo states of Sarawak and Sabah, and the tiny oil-rich Sultanate of Brunei, still a protectorate of Britain. I don't think Sukarno's charges that Malaysia was a neo-colonialist creation propped up by Britain were entirely unfounded. But in any case, he was easily contained by the efficient British Commonwealth forces, which had a lot of experience fighting in the Malayan emergency against the Chinese communists, which lasted officially from 1948 to 1960. Although isolated remnants of the Malayan Communist Party still exist, the British handling of the emergency was successful. The Indonesians were facing experienced counterinsurgency jungle fighters. Some of the finest troops you could find anywhere in the world were concentrated in Borneo at the time. There were Malaysian troops, some Australians, and of course the famous Gurkhas from Nepal, said to be the best soldiers in the world. What action there was took place in what I call real jungle. Triple canopy, impenetrable rainforest, thickly coating steep hills and mountains. Later journalists would write about the war, quote, in the jungles of Vietnam. There was some heavy forest in Vietnam, and some areas like the U Minh forest were rather like the Everglades of Florida. But I never saw real jungle in any part of Vietnam or Cambodia. Borneo had the real thing. Strategically, the Commonwealth troops didn't have all that hard a job, simply because there were only about 9 tracks along the border with Indonesia and Borneo, Kalimantan, though through which opposing troops could penetrate. The most difficult part was simply being there, operating helicopters and moving troops and supplies around that impenetrable and wildly beautiful place, which was also inhabited by splendidly independent and colourful tribespeople, the Ibans and Dayaks. For the foreign correspondent and the career soldiers in the British Army, confrontation was the last of the fun wars. There were few shots fired in anger, and all the excitement of setting up forward jungle bases and playing soldiers in exotic country. The first story Peter Barrett and Neil Davis had to cover in March 1964 was the aftermath of an Indonesian attempt to infiltrate about 100 troops through a low-lying swampy river complex near Tawau on the extreme northeast coast of Sabah. It was a ghastly place to mount a military operation, as there were few places where your feet could touch dry ground. All but a handful of the Indonesian soldiers died in the jungle before they even made it to the Sabah border. And when we arrived at Tawau, the Gurkhas were picking up 5 or 6 stragglers who were only too happy to surrender after their nightmare journey through the swamps. I could not have had a better travelling companion than Peter Barnett. He has a well-developed sense of humour and was professionally very resourceful and innovative. He naturally had an eye for the ladies, particularly if they were well endowed between neck and waist. The Dayak and Iban girls do have one thing in common. They are big-breasted. As a dedicated voyeur, Peter had a field day in Borneo. The two Australians went back to Kuching, and Barnett returned to Singapore for a between assignments ration of more tall tales from Ted. Neil Davis prepared for what he later remembered as one of his most memorable journeys up the Rejang River by longboat to visit a detachment of Gurkha troops deep in the interior near a tiny village called Belaga. The Rejang River in Sarawak is one of the great rivers of the world. When I finally got to a place called Kapit, which is roughly 200 miles, 320 kilometres inland, a 7,000-ton freighter was docked there, which illustrates how big the river was, or is. It is fast-flowing and rather frightening in its upper reaches, through heavy jungle country and tribal areas controlled by former headhunters, who had barely time to give up the habit. The Ibans were the sea Dyaks, and the land Dyaks did not encroach on their territory. The Ibans were the most aggressive, and they were great boat people as well. Beyond Kapit were the renowned Palugas Rapids, and it took local experts to negotiate them. The Rejang was about a mile wide at that point, with formidable rocks jutting up from the riverbed and more just below the surface, which were even more dangerous. At one point, they brought the longboat to the bank and asked me to walk a mile or two because it was too risky to have me on board. They explained that I did not know how to move my weight about in the boat, and in any case, I had my expensive camera gear and film, and they were worried about that. I walked along the riverbank watching them, which was exciting enough in itself, until I came upon a wild tiger. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, and exciting 5 seconds, seeing that tiger in the wild, the only time I ever did. He was about 100 metres away and looked about as big as a pony. I was terrified and knew it was no good yelling to my escorts who were out in the middle of the roaring rapids. If I waved to them, they would just wave back. So I stood in the water, as far away from the bank as I could, waiting for that bloody animal to come to me. There was a flash of movement, and he was gone. Of course, he was probably as unnerved as I was, and had well and truly pissed off. Davis was relieved to join with the Nepalese Gurkha troops at Belaga, and they immediately invited him to a game of volleyball. The Gurkhas were the best disciplined soldiers I've ever seen, the most courteous and intensely loyal. If they have a fault, it is a lack of flexibility. Once committed to an action, they press on regardless. If their officer is killed, they have been known to carry on with the original plan to the point of destruction, but they were rarely placed at a disadvantage. When they were in the jungle on operations, they did not smoke or talk and moved soundlessly like cats. Apart from rifles, they carried their kukris, a wicked curved knife that was hooked in a way to make it easier to decapitate an enemy. It was kept razor sharp, and if you asked to see the kukri, they would gladly show it, and then, before sheathing it, would startle you by nicking their finger and drawing blood. This was tradition. A Gurkha never draws his kukri without drawing blood. Maybe I'm a smart ass, but this is the kukri which I purchased and gave to my son when he was 11 years old. There is the tooth in the mouth of the kukri to feed a blood meal to the spirit of the kukri every time it is withdrawn from the sheath. This is the sharpening steel, which lives in its own hole in the sheath, and this is the minor blade for cutting string and peeling oranges. I just thought that you probably needed to know before we proceed with this reading of the book. Drawing blood. After losing his sweat on the volleyball court, Davis was taken to the mess and introduced to another Gurkha tradition, their daily tot of 100% overproof rum. It was issued in an army pannikin and seemed an enormous slug, and their method was to drink it down in one go, which I did too. There didn't seem to be any limit to the ritual, and I got enormously drunk. The next thing I knew, a Gurkha orderly was standing beside my bed at 5 a.m. with a cup of hot, strong, sweet, milky tea, urgently needed for my blistering hangover, and a reminder that I had promised to go crocodile shooting that day. Davis did, but it was not a happy day, lurching about crocodile-infested waters in narrow canoes with Gurkhas obviously impervious to hangovers. There are many stories about the Gurkhas and their attitudes to combat, but one of the most famous actually took place in Borneo while I was there, and was told to me with great gusto by a British Gurkha officer. The Gurkhas were not trained as paratroops, but they were asked if they would be prepared to jump from a Hercules C-130 transport aircraft into combat against the Indonesians if the need arose. The Gurkhas had the right to turn down this request because they had not been trained for this combat role. Now, the Gurkhas usually agreed to anything, but on this occasion they provisionally rejected the plan. But the next day, one of their NCOs sought out the British officer who had made the request and said they had discussed the matter further and would be prepared to jump under certain conditions. "What are they?" asked the British officer. The Gurkhas told him they would jump if the land was marshy or reasonably soft with no rocky outcrops because they were inexperienced in falling. The British officer considered this and said that the dropping area would almost certainly be over jungle and there would not be any rocky outcrops, so that seemed all right. Was there anything else? "Yes," said the Gurkhas. They wanted the plane to fly as slowly as possible and no more than 100 feet high. The British pointed out that the planes always did fly as slowly as possible when dropping troops, but to jump from 100 feet was impossible because the parachutes would not open in time from that height. "Oh," said the Gurkhas, "that's all right then. We'll jump with parachutes. Anywhere. You didn't mention parachutes before." So, if we are to believe Neil Davis, then the Imperial Gurkhas were prepared to jump out of aeroplanes without parachutes from 100 feet, wearing full battle gear. And that's how life was back in 1963. Landing in a helicopter in Borneo was almost as dangerous as jumping, with or without a parachute. The few emergency landing pads were created by the ingenious method of winching men down onto sharply pointed hilltops. Finding a shelf where the ground rose less sharply than the smoke from their cooking fires, they hacked out a clearing. Next, a small bulldozer was winched down to literally flatten off the mountaintop. The only other emergency landing possibility was to ditch in a river. The odds were not good. Even where there were established landing pads at the forward bases, you had to come down through a kind of a funnel between 60 and 90-metre trees. I flew into these pads on quite a few occasions. The rotors used to strip leaves from the outer branches as you descended. The trouble was that once a helicopter started its controlled descent through that very restricted area, it was difficult, almost impossible, to get the power or manoeuvrability to go up until the soldiers left the aircraft. So you were committed to landing, and if there were any enemy around, they would be able to pick you off. It was Neil Davis's first introduction to filming a war, but he neither saw nor heard a shot fired in anger. Here endeth part 1 of the last of the fun wars.